There was a moment in my 40s where I felt trapped in my job, but I didn't know what to do about it. But I did change my situation. I didn't quit my job overnight, but I reduced it on purpose. And the reason I could do that was because I stopped looking at my life as fixed and I started looking at what I actually had to work with. Like most people, I felt like it was all or nothing. I believed that I would either have to stay in my full-time job to earn the salary that I earned so that I could afford the financial commitments that I had, or I would need to reduce my hours and go part-time, and maybe I could stay in my role part-time, maybe I couldn't, or I would have to quit completely. But that wasn't realistic for me, particularly when I had financial obligations. So instead, what I did was I took a step back and asked a different question, which was, what is actually keeping me working at this level? That's when I started to properly review my situation, not just my income, but the assets that I had, my expenses, and what options could I have if I thought about things differently. And if I put everything on the table and thought about, this is what I want to achieve, how could I potentially achieve that in my current circumstances? Because when you do that, when you really think about everything and you think, nothing is off the table, you start to realize that you have a lot more flexibility than you actually think. For me, that meant looking at my family home. We lived in Surrey with a modest house, but a very high mortgage and high monthly bills to run that home. I also looked at my monthly expenditure. What was it I was spending every month? And is there anything there that could change? And then I looked at what is it I actually needed, not what I wanted, but what did I actually need? Not to live an excessive life, but to live a comfortable lifestyle so that I could then begin to make some decisions. And that was a huge turning point for me, actually looking at those things individually to see how collectively they could inform any decision that I made moving forwards. Because instead of chasing more income, and sometimes that's really difficult, particularly in the workplace when you hit a certain ceiling, I focused instead on reducing pressure. And as I say, that opened up choices for me, real practical choices that I could then implement. And that was really what changed everything for me. Now, obviously, I needed to have conversations with my family, with my husband, with my son, and think about what decisions we could make. And fortunately, my son was at a point in his life where he was at work, and so he could be independent of us, and I could think independently about the decisions that we made without necessarily having to consider school, etc. And that's really what changed everything, because so often when you're in your 40s, you think it's already too late to start thinking differently and to live differently, especially if you've still got children at school. One of the things that really made a difference to how I was thinking was the fact that in your 40s, you're probably only halfway through your life. And so there's an awful lot of time left to fill. A lot of that still in the workplace, maybe 20 years still in the workplace. Thinking about how you work isn't a decision to take lightly. And it's not a small decision, because another 20 years of working is quite something to consider. So when I considered what decisions and what choices I could make, one of those choices was actually to retrain. And how could I retrain in a way that would give me income, not just now, but in the future? And so for me, one of the things that I felt quite passionately about was how I could help other people. I'd always had this idea that I could do counselling or coaching in some way, usually because in the workforce, I was the go-to person. People would come to me with their problems. And so I really enjoyed that, and it felt very natural to me. So I retrained as a psychotherapist, as a counsellor and a coach. And that gave me a lot more independence, because then it meant that I could either go into employment and work in an agency setting, or I could work for myself. And therapy is something that you can do into your 70s and 80s and beyond. And so that really changed how I saw my future, because suddenly I wasn't dependent on one job, one structure, and one path. I actually had a lot more choices. Another big decision was location. It was, where should we live? Should we continue living in Surrey, or could we move to a part of the country that was a lot more cost effective? And that's what we did. We moved to South Wales. And when we did that, everything shifted. Our housing costs reduced, the financial pressure dropped, and the gap between what I earn and what I needed became a lot smaller. And that's the part people often miss. It isn't one dramatic move, although for some people, maybe moving from Surrey to South Wales would be considered a dramatic move. For me, I was only 2 hours away from London still, so it wasn't it wasn't hugely impactful in the way in which I carried out my life. And nor was it hugely impactful for my husband. He got a similar job in South Wales to that he'd had in Surrey. And eventually he was also able to stop work, which was great because we had a lifestyle that could be managed by a single income. And it was that series of smaller intentional decisions about the type of work that I did, the area that we lived, the way that we spent our money, and reducing those monthly expenses, all added up in order to save not just money, but also time and the options that we had in the way that we spent our time. And that's really what allowed me to reduce my working hours and not stay stuck. It wasn't just luck, it wasn't a sudden leap, but it was a gradual redesign of how our life worked for us. Because you don't need to escape work overnight. And in fact, in your 40s or your 50s, you've probably still got a good 10 to 20 years of work ahead of you. So it's about being really intentional about how you spend those working hours in order to create a life where work fits around your life and your life doesn't fit around your work. And that really started for me by looking at what we already had and asking, what could this make possible for us? So if this has got you thinking about what's possible in your own situation, I'd genuinely love to know, so please leave a comment. What's the one thing that you feel might be keeping you right where you are now? And if you're working through these kind of decisions, subscribe, because this is exactly what I share on this channel. So all that's left for me to say now is thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.